Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. And this little critter here, hello, this is Mildred. Yes, she wants to play, and she always gets annoyed when I start ignoring her. Say hello. Yes, I know. What a good girl you are. She's getting used to getting picked up now. You see, this is why I do this, actually, to get her used to it. Okay, I'm going to put you down, and we're going to play fetch, okay? So here you go. There you go. Anyway, so we have to get out our little hoochie thingy. Wait a minute. This is all very important. There we go. Ready? Go! That's her reward for being good and not like scratching my eyes out when I pick her up. So where are we? We were talking recently about trumpets, about Beethoven's trumpet parts at the end of the Eroica, and we had a really interesting discussion about whether or not they should be corrected or not corrected, and people that do and people that don't. But in amongst all of that, one of you asked a very interesting question, and that question was this: why is it that classical trumpet parts are so boring, and that the brilliant custom of Baroque trumpet playing with high, screamy trumpets playing incredibly florid and elaborate trumpet lines died out, which it did. I mean, it really died out. It went away. Poof, whoosh, gone. And I'm going to try and explain that to you, why that happened and sort of how it happened. And we don't even need to use musical examples because it's really an aesthetic argument. It's not really something that you need to, if you know a Haydn symphony or a Mozart symphony or a Beethoven symphony, then you know how classical trumpet parts work. And inherent in the question is the fact that you know Baroque trumpet playing, as, for example, you hear in Bach's choral works like the B minor Mass or the Magnificat or the Brandenburg Concerto No. 2 with its unbelievably high trumpet parts, really scary. Oh, it's all over the place. Really crazy and exciting. So let's talk first about the nature of the trumpet. This I will have an example of. The nature of the trumpet, which is part of the whole discussion here. In order for a trumpet to play that really crazy Baroque stuff, you may have noticed it's very, very high. It's high and piercing and screamy. And the reason for that is because the trumpet only has, the natural trumpet anyway, the sufficient notes in a particular key of that scale, of whatever key it's in. It was almost always in D major, although the second Brandenburg Concerto, I think, is in F. But usually they were in D or sometimes E flat or in C. But, if you look at Baroque pieces where they use trumpets and drums, they're almost always in D major. That was the standard trumpet of the day. Now, if you understand anything about acoustics, if you want to find out like where all the notes are on an instrument or on a string, here, take your typical vibrating string thing, right? You have a vibrating string, one string. They call it a monochord, one string. If you cut it in half and each half is vibrating, you get an octave. You get the note an octave above the fundamental note that you get when you pluck the whole string. And then if you do it in quarters, you get 2 octaves above. And all of the notes of the scale in between are different fractions. For example, the fraction 3/2 gives you a fifth, I think. I think it's 3/2, something like that. And 5/4, 4/5, 5/4 I think is a fourth, and so on and so on. It goes up and up and up and up and up. But in order to get all the smaller notes, fractions have to get tinier and tinier and tinier. And the less bit of string you use, the higher the pitch. Right? Because you have one thing is the whole string, that's the octave, your fundamental tone. Then half of it is an octave higher. Then a quarter is an octave higher. And as you break up the string into tinier and tinier bits, you get higher and higher and higher notes. Now, if you want a full scale of 8 notes between an octave, in one octave, you have to use tiny fractions. And that means you have to use high pitches. Well, that's what happens with a trumpet. So here is an example. This is what they call the overtone series. This is the series of notes you get when you do the fraction business in a particular key on a trumpet. So here it is. Bazumba. There you go. That's the overtone series. And as you can see, you start to get more notes the higher up you go. It starts out like rather low, and then you've got your octave and your fifth and your fourth and things like that. And then as you get higher, you get more and more and more notes. Now, not all of those notes are in tune according to our tempered system of tuning. Some of them are too sharp, some of them are too flat. And they can be adjusted. They're the ones that are colored in, by the way, in that example, the dark notes. Those are the ones that are out of tune in our existing tonal system. But they can be adjusted by the player, by what they call lipping. You know, you're like, this is embouchure. You know, you have a mouthpiece, right? And you know, if you've ever tried to play a brass instrument, if you just blow into it, nothing happens at all. I mean, that's not how they work. They work, the note actually, the pitch is created, the frequency of vibration is created by the player, who basically does a Bronx cheer. You're going, you know, you're making your lips vibrate. And how fast your lips vibrate, depending on how hard you blow, and how open or closed your mouth is when you make them vibrate, that is what's going to determine what note comes out the other end of the trumpet. The trumpet itself, the length of tubing, determines the pitch, and it determines the timbre of the note. But the actual work is done by the player in the mouthpiece around there. And that's what gives you the note. And they can adjust those notes by smushing around their like this, you know, like their lips, like this, you know, very tiny, fine adjustments. It's real artistry required to do that. And so on a natural trumpet in the Baroque period, in order to get the notes that they used to play those really elaborate trumpet solos, they had to play very high. I mean, the Baroque trumpet, the actual natural trumpet, it's like 8 feet of tubing. It was long if you were to stretch it all out. You know, you remember those long trumpets you see in, you know, heraldry, you know, sort of movies. You know, the king is coming and they've got the straight trumpets and they go out like forever. They're long. They curl them up so they take up less space. But the amount of tubing is long. A modern trumpet, which has valves, is quite a bit shorter. It's about 4 or 5 feet of tubing, whereas the natural trumpets had more tubing, and they had a very low principal note, which you never heard. And then you started getting octaves and fourths and fifths, and then the other notes to fill in the scale, the higher up you got. So on the natural trumpet, if you wanted to get those notes, you had to play very, very high. And that's very difficult because, you know, you're making very fine adjustments to your lips. You have to blow hard and you have to blow, you know, narrow, and you're trying to adjust the notes that don't usually work in our particular tempered scale. And some people were better at it than others. And it was really an extraordinary specialty to be able to play trumpets like that. And trumpeters who could in those days were very highly valued and prized. And some of their names have come down to us. I mean, we know who some of them were, but there weren't many of them. And Baroque composers tended not to care because in those days the trumpeter couldn't play it. He wouldn't play it. He would play as many notes as he could. You know, it wasn't like, you know, we assume that because Bach and Handel and composers like that wrote these crazy trumpet parts that there were trumpeters who actually played them the way they wrote them. And we have no evidence that happened at all. They would have been simplified. They could have played them on other instruments. God only knows what they did. But they were very, very difficult. Why did they write that way? That's the real question. Why did they write trumpet parts like that? Well, the answer has to do with the Baroque aesthetics of the orchestra. The Baroque orchestra was an anomalous thing in certain respects. All music in those days was vocal music. I mean, it was the idea of an instrument was to imitate the human voice. And instruments that were accompanying were generally relegated to the continuo parts. Remember that harpsichord on the bottom that you always have the keyboard or some other thing, and you have basses and cellos, and then violins sort of play the melody for the orchestra, but the basic orchestra was strings plus continuo. That's what you have in Handel's Concerti Grossi Opus 6, Corelli's Concerti Grossi Opus 6. Opus 6 was a popular opus number, I guess. But your basic orchestra was simply strings and a continuo. Anything else was a solo voice. It was a singer. It was on top of the orchestra and it got the tune. And the rest of the orchestra was all compacted in the bottom and it was doing accompaniment. So the trumpet parts in these Baroque things were voices. solo voices. I mean, some of you may have noticed if you listen to like a Handel oratorio or a Handel opera, where he uses very lavish orchestration. You've got Bach too. You get solos with oboes and trumpets and horns and bassoons and all of these wonderful instruments. But, in the big final chorus, it's just like strings. The orchestra never plays together. All of those instruments never play together as an orchestra, as an ensemble, because all of these wind instruments or strange stringed instruments or other things, they were all solo instruments to be used only as soloists in specific numbers in the larger work. They were not part of an integrated, self-sustaining ensemble. That was the aesthetic of Baroque music and the way these instruments were treated. So the trumpet was a solo voice, and in order for it to be a solo voice, it was a soprano voice. It was a high voice that played tunes way up, as high as it could, because that was the only way to get enough notes to be able to play a melody. Now, all of that changed when we get to the classical period. You may have noticed that most classical symphonies do not use harpsichord accompaniments. And when they do, they're kind of annoying. They get in the way as often as not, because the guy, of course, who sort of evolved out of that was Haydn, by the way, who invented everything. But what we need to know is that the classical orchestra is a coherent, unified, self-sustaining ensemble. Always. That is, any instrument at any point can have a little solo, and everyone else accompanies. It creates harmony all by itself. It doesn't need to have a harpsichord filling in the harmony or doing the harmony along with the bass line. The other instruments do that. In order to do that, they have to blend. The key is blending. The key is creating a rich, sustaining, independent, massive harmony out of which any instrument, whether the violins or the oboes or the clarinets or the bassoons or the horns or whoever it is, the cellos, they can emerge and play the tune. That is a completely different aesthetic from what we had in the Baroque period. So in order for that to happen, every instrument in the classical orchestra has to be both at the same time a soloist and an accompaniment. Now, what does this do to the trumpet? Well, it kind of destroys the ability of the trumpet to do its solo thing, because you can't have both. The bottom line is you can't have your cake and eat it too if you're a trumpeter. If you're a trumpeter soloist, you're playing high notes up top. But if you're not doing that, if you're just accompanying, then you're playing lower notes. And those lower notes there are many fewer of them than you could play if you're a soloist, because you're playing lower down in the instrument's basic overtone series. So you're dealing with your fundamental note, fifths, fourths, thirds, fanfare figures and all that. And that's what we get in the classical orchestra. Most trumpeters, as I pointed out before, were not orchestral musicians. They were military musicians or band musicians. They were used to playing simple things very loudly. They were not, art music players. And the great trumpeters, the great Baroque trumpeters who could play all that screechy stuff on high, well, that technique basically disappeared. It disappeared when the trumpet entered the classical orchestra, and the purpose and constitution of that orchestra was built on an aesthetic that was entirely different from the Baroque aesthetic. And so that tradition of trumpet playing died out as trumpet concertos died out. As the concerto ceased to be the main instrumental form of abstract instrumental music, the concerto grosso or the solo concerto or whatever, that was the thing. In the classical period, of course, it became the symphony. And a symphony, by definition, is a work for full orchestra that has no permanent solos. Of course, concertos survived as well. You had violin concertos, you had piano concertos, keyboard concertos of various kinds. But the trumpet concertos style, aside from Haydn's and Hummel's and a couple people, in the late classical period, where they were experimenting with instruments that could play full ranges of notes at a pitch that was not all the way at the top of the instrument, that technique and that style of playing vanished. only to be revived really now in the 20th century. It's a fascinating history of instrumental technique, because the trumpeters, of course, were getting quite bored. They wanted to be able to play more notes, and composers wanted to have trumpets and timpani, for that matter, in different keys and to help play melodies once in a while. I mean, every so often, a composer would try and give a trumpet a melody or a bit of a melody. Mozart did it in his 39th Symphony. Haydn did it in a couple of symphonies, in his Drum Roll Symphony, where he uses the trumpets melodically. And also, I think in the Oxford Symphony, there's a beautiful moment in the finale when he has the trumpet softly going da, da, da. They tried. They wanted them to be able to participate more in the classical orchestra, but they also had to be able to blend and to do their accompanying thing and provide rhythmic figures and fanfares at lower pitches. So in order to do that, we needed valves. And valves popped up sometime around, the middle of the 19th century. You were starting to get trumpets with valves that could play more notes, and the rest of, as they say, is history. Now trumpets can do anything. But it was a long and frustrating process for the much suffering trumpeters of the various epochs. And that is why Beethoven's trumpet parts are such an issue, because the quality of his players was not what they had been in the Baroque period, because his use of the instruments was very, very different from what Baroque composers were doing. The Eroica Symphony is not a concerto. You would be very hard-pressed to point out any single instrument which dominates the Eroica Symphony. At any one moment, you have clarinets, you have oboes, you have flutes, you have the violins, of course, you have cellos. At the very opening, the tune is for the cellos, right? You have horns, and the trumpets are sort of sadly sitting there contributing what they can contribute. And that was why at the end of the first movement, when they finally have a chance seemingly to get the tune, and they don't get it, because I said originally incorrectly that Beethoven's trumpets didn't have all the notes. Well, they did, but Beethoven didn't trust the notes, or he couldn't trust the notes. He couldn't trust the players to do them, to make them in tune. He couldn't trust his instruments, to reliably produce them, or whatever reason. He didn't want those trumpets to be able to be exposed in that way, only to blow the most important climax at the end in the coda of the whole first movement, right? So he had to be very, very cautious. And that's why we who do not have to be as cautious can fix those trumpet parts. But that's the story. That's the story in the change in musical expression. And I hope this has answered your question. And really, it's a self-evident answer, because you get it when you just listen to the music. You listen to Baroque music with trumpet parts like that, listen to classical music, you won't hear those trumpet parts, because listen to the difference in what the orchestra is doing. An orchestra with a harpsichord continuo on the bottom, doing all the harmonic stuff, and all the other voices being solo voices, and a classical orchestra where you have various instrumental components emerging at various times, at any time, while everyone else has to accompany and take a back seat and sometimes come forward. It's beautiful. It's wonderful to hear the difference and ponder how it happened, and why it happened. It was a change in taste, a change in aesthetics, a change in instrument construction. It was many things. And I should add, most importantly, the rise of the sonata style, which meant classical music had development sections. That is, large forms had areas of very rapid change of tonality. When you're going through one key to another key to another key to another key, you had to be able to use all of the keys to try and dramatize the style of music. And dramatizing the style of music and using different keys means you had to have instruments that could play in those keys. And natural trumpets, timpani, these more limited instruments, couldn't do it. They just couldn't. I mean, they didn't have the notes to play in all of those different keys. You'll also notice that in Baroque pieces that have trumpets, they're in D major, and so the trumpets play as long as it's in D major, maybe for a whole movement, for most of it. But as soon as the music starts to go elsewhere, those instruments drop out. They were useless. And that's what happened in the classical orchestra, too. In development sections, for example, listen to any piece by Beethoven or Mozart that has trumpets. Beethoven's Second Symphony, for example, or one of the late Haydn symphonies, the Surprise Symphony, one of those, When you get to the development section, the trumpets are almost entirely absent because the music is going through many keys in which the trumpets can't play. And so there you go. That's what happened. So it was a stylistic change, a fascinating stylistic change. And that's the answer. I hope that that isn't too complicated. I hope that you sort of can listen to your own recordings now, I mean, and get a sense of why what the music is doing is making the participation of the instruments, forcing the instruments to participate in different ways. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me, and take care.